Welcome to the Mindcut series, episode 4.
Great to be here.
Today, we're jumping straight into a whole collection of ideas about attraction, relationships, and, well, what's happening in the modern dating world.
Yeah, based on some really interesting articles and discussions that were shared.
Exactly. And our goal is basically to pull out the most insightful bits for you.
We'll be looking at some surprising links, like between politics and who people find attractive.
And the tricky world of online identities, authenticity,
Plus some deeper evolutionary reasons behind mate selection.
and maybe some psychological principles that could actually help guide choices in relationships.
Yeah, get ready for maybe a few aha moments as we explore this sometimes pretty confusing territory.
Okay, so where do we start? That political division idea.
Let's unpack that first. It started with this headline about left-wing women learning to love right-wing men.
Right, which immediately sounds a bit strange.
Exactly. And it led to this idea of political division almost becoming like a sexual fetish in some online fandoms.
A fetish? Wow. So, people seeing others across the political aisle as potential sexual conquests.
That's the concept. The idea of right-wing men wanting a liberal art hoe or leftist women desiring a right-wing anon.
It definitely goes against what we normally think,
Right.
right? That whole idea of assortative mating.
Precisely. We tend to be drawn to people who are similar to us politically, socially, in values.
So why would this opposite trend be happening, or at least getting talked about?
Well, the discussion pointed to some studies looking at dating patterns of progressive women,
Suggesting there might be something to it.
possibly substantiating the trend, yeah. And then you start thinking about, okay, what qualities do women often find attractive in men?
Things like self-sufficiency, ambition, income.
Exactly. And then you look at whether those qualities correlate more with certain political leanings.
So the idea is those traits might be more common among men with more conservative voting patterns.
That's the hypothesis.
Right.
And there's some data that seems to back this up, or at least point in that direction.
Like what?
Well, studies showing men who rate themselves higher on masculinity tend to lean towards supporting conservative candidates.
Okay.
And remember that UK study from a few years back, linking height to conservative voting.
Oh, yeah, vaguely. Around 2016, 2017.
That's the one. And then there's this concept of social dominance orientation,
Which-
basically a preference for social hierarchy, maybe a bit more assertiveness or desire for control. Men higher in this trait are more likely to favor things like lower taxes, strong military.
Yeah, and the thinking is maybe those underlying traits are seen as attractive regardless of the political label.
Exactly. So the attractive male qualities might sort of cluster on the right, even if a woman's stated political preference is different.
It's quite a counterintuitive idea.
It really is. And what was noticeable was the lack of the reverse example being prominent. Right-wing women wanting to date left-wing men wasn't really a headline.
Instead, it was more like that tweet someone mentioned. Wanting a boyfriend who looks like a Republican but isn't one.
Right, wanting that sort of traditional masculine presentation, maybe, but without the associated politics.
Which raises another interesting point you mentioned, woke fishing.
Yeah, this idea that men, perhaps more often those on the right, might actively conceal their political views online.
To attract women who might otherwise screen them out.
Precisely. And for that strategy to even exist, let alone work, there has to be some basis in reality, right? Some women must actually be attracted to the persona, even if the politics underneath are different.
You wouldn't pretend if it had zero chance of success.
Exactly. Which kind of leads us neatly into the next topic, online personas and potential hypocrisy.
Yes, the Harry Sison example.
Right. The New York Post story about him being this rising Gen Z TikTok star for the Democratic National Committee, so projecting a very specific progressive image.
And then what happened?
Well, a trend started on TikTok. Multiple women claiming Sison had slid into my DMs
Okay.
and that they'd exchanged messages, even nude photos and videos.
Oh.
And there were allegations about things he supposedly said, valuing women's bodies over their minds, claiming he didn't have a roster when he apparently did.
So he was talking to multiple women simultaneously while claiming otherwise.
That was the accusation. And then these women started finding each other online.
Connecting the dots.
Exactly. Posting about the perceived duplicity.
What stood out about the Gen Z aspect?
Well, There weren't reports of actual, physical encounters. But the sense of betrayal seemed really strong, specifically because of the intimate messages and media shared.
So it's a kind of emotional or digital betrayal, even without a formal relationship.
Yeah, it occupies this kind of moral gray area, doesn't it? It's lying, but it's not necessarily breaking a legal agreement or a defined relationship commitment.
Makes you wonder, like you said, would the outrage be the same for someone with a different public image? Like an Andrew Tate type?
Probably not, right? The key element here seems to be the hypocrisy.
The mismatch between the public pro-woman persona and the alleged private actions.
Absolutely. The story arguably only becomes a big deal because of that projected image. A young, attractive guy with access talking to lots of women isn't exactly news otherwise.
Without the carefully crafted progressive image, it's a different narrative entirely.
Which brings us to why men might adopt certain personas online in the first place.
Right. What are the potential reasons?
Well, several possibilities. Signaling safety or security, maybe trying to appear less threatening.
Or aligning with certain political beliefs perceived as more sensitive or desirable?
Exactly. Or even signaling they're looking for something long-term, not just casual.
And what does the research say is the top trait people look for?
Kindness. Consistently, across genders, David Buss's work highlights kindness as number one. So presenting a kind image makes strategic sense.
But social media makes it hard to tell genuine signals from noise, right?
Especially for people getting lots of online validation, like Sison seemed to be. It can create a real gap between the online portrayal and, well, real life.
As this case seems to show. And you mentioned there wasn't much of a real penalty for him.
Seemingly not. Some even argued it might, ironically, boost his notoriety.
And how did different groups interpret this whole situation?
It was fascinating. You had some often men associated with red pill ideas using evolutionary logic.
Saying his behavior was just what, maximizing mating opportunities?
Basically. While many women online used gossip and public shaming.
Kind of like social enforcement, warning other women.
Exactly, which raises that classic debate. Is this behavior a bug, or is it just the system from an evolutionary standpoint?
Like the discussions around Leonardo DiCaprio's dating patterns.
Right. You get evolutionary explanations for why men might prefer younger partners, and then interpretations of women's shaming behavior as a form of price enforcement for commitment.
But does that shaming actually work effectively?
That's debatable, isn't it?
Yeah.
Especially if only a small percentage of women might directly benefit from a specific man's commitment.
Okay, this connects to another big shift. Women earning more than men. How does that impact things?
Well, one way to look at the sneaky guy phenomenon, like the Sussin example.
Is it reaction to that economic shift?
Potentially. If there's a growing imbalance where you have more socioeconomically successful women compared to men.
Men who feel they're falling behind might use these tactics?
Could be. Using deception to kind of level the playing field if they earn less or are less educated. The cynical procreator propagandist idea comes up here too.
And the data backs this up. Women earning more.
Yeah, particularly women under 30 in many major U.S. cities. They're often earning as much as or more than their male peers.
Which could lead to, what would you call it? Soft harem dynamics.
It's a provocative term, but yeah. The idea that women might become more open to sharing a high-value partner if suitable single partners are scarce.
That Steven Pinker quote comes to mind.
Most women would rather share John F. Kennedy than have Bobo the Clown all to themselves. It's stark, but it captures that potential trade-off.
Are things like polyamory or open relationships related to this?
Some people argue they are. A possible outcome of what's sometimes called the deregulation of the sexual marketplace, especially if significant numbers of men are falling behind economically or socially.
It's interesting how this is often framed, though. Like, men are floundering, but women are most affected.
Right. The focus often lands on the difficulty women face finding partners, rather than digging into why some men might be struggling. There's often a different societal reaction to men's struggles compared to other groups.
Is there a sense that men are being blamed for past issues without getting current benefits?
Some men express that feeling, yeah. Like they're paying for a patriarchy they don't feel part of, but not getting the traditional mating advantages.
You mentioned Kurt Gray's theory.
The moral dyad theory. The idea we categorize groups as either vulnerable feelers needing protection or thinking doers who are agents.
And political ideologies apply this differently.
Yes. It might explain why there's sometimes less focus or sympathy for struggling men, particularly within certain academic or left-leaning circles that might frame male issues specifically through the lens of white men, sometimes overlooking broader trends.
Like the shifts in Trump support among different groups in 2024, perhaps.
Exactly. It's complex.
Okay, let's switch gears a bit. What about sexual performance? Is it always the man's fault if things don't go perfectly?
Well, there's a noticeable asymmetry in how we talk about it, isn't there?
How so?
Think about erectile dysfunction versus a woman's inability to orgasm. ED is almost never framed as the woman's fault.
Right.
But if a woman doesn't orgasm, you often hear blame directed at the man. His head game is weak. Things like that.
You don't hear the equivalent aimed at women regarding male ED.
Exactly. And then there's the evolutionary angle. Male orgasm is necessary for procreation, biologically speaking. Female orgasm isn't, though it certainly plays roles in bonding and pleasure.
So maybe that contributes to a perception of a lower, or at least different, bar for female performance.
Perhaps. And the data on orgasm rates reflects complexity, too. Women tend to orgasm much more consistently in committed relationships versus casual hookups.
Which makes sense intuitively. Connection matters.
It does. It reminds me of the concept of demisexual and the sort of humorous take that it just describes many women's typical experience needing emotional connection first.
And the idea of orgasm billionaires.
Yeah, contrasting women who orgasm frequently and easily with the varied experiences many men have. It's not a uniform picture for either sex.
Definitely not. Okay, let's move to that Netflix show, Adolescence.
Yeah.
What was the fallout there?
Right, so the show's premise is an unpopular 13-year-old UK boy gets drawn into online radicalization, ends up stabbing someone.
And the initial reaction?
Well, some noted it realistically portrayed the chaotic vibe of some UK schools. That was a point William Costello made.
But it also leaned heavily on certain online talking points.
Yes, lots of references to red pill or manosphere ideas like the 80-20 rule.
Even though it diverged from reality in some ways.
Quite significantly, it seems. When you look at actual knife crime stats or the demographics of who follows Andrew Tate polls showed higher interest among Black and Asian men in the UK.
And labeling a 13-year-old an incel? That seems odd.
Very odd. The argument was made that maybe his distress was more about being called that name, that slur, rather than actual prepubescent sexual frustration.
So it felt like art masquerading as a reality.
That was the critique. Good cinematography, maybe, but the acting, especially when explaining mating psychology, apparently fell flat.
And it sparked some strange panel discussions.
Yeah, invitations asking for a pro-men side on a fictional story about a child stabbing someone. Very bizarre framing.
Plus plans to screen it in Parliament and schools.
As a cautionary tale, supposedly. But it raised huge questions about its accuracy and who it was really for.
Especially given that widespread incel stabbings aren't actually happening.
Right, despite factors you might think would lead to it. There's even academic work, like from Buss and Costello, using evolutionary logic to explain why there isn't more violence like that.
So a real disconnect seeing serious people treat this fictional show as fact.
Absolutely. And there were suggestions the real-life case that might have inspired it involved a perpetrator from a different demographic group anyway.
Did the show try to explore masculinity itself?
Episode 3 apparently tried, but the boy's character lacked strong answers or insights. And interestingly, he didn't have the typical broken home backstory trope.
So what was the takeaway message supposed to be?
Maybe something about the dangers of a threatened, humiliated male ego. It's unclear, but linking it directly to inceldom seemed flawed.
Especially since most actual incels probably despise Andrew Tate.
Exactly. It falls into that outgroup homogeneity effect, lumping diverse, often conflicting online groups under one manosphere banner.
And data suggests incels lean more center-left anyway.
That's what some studies indicate, not the right-wing stereotype often portrayed.
What about the casting? A normal-looking boy.
That choice could be seen as trying to generate sympathy, reinforcing the narrative that online influences corrupted him. But it begs the question of how much real-world bullying would actually justify such violence.
And the 80-20 rule felt irrelevant to the plot.
Completely shoehorned in, it seems.
Yet political figures were endorsing it.
Yes, people like Keir Starmer suggesting it should be widely viewed, which feeds into concerns it could be used to justify more online censorship.
Wow. Okay, quite a minefield there. Let's shift to something potentially more constructive. How psychology can help choose the right partner.
Yes, this is crucial, isn't it? Work and marriage or family life are consistently the biggest drivers of life satisfaction.
But there's tons of advice for careers and almost a stigma around asking for help with relationships.
There really is. Maybe a perception that needing romance advice implies you have low mate value.
Or that women are wonderful affect more suspicion if a man seeks dating advice.
Could be part of it. Now, we talked about assortative mating, liking similar people. That's descriptively true. People do tend to pair up with similar others.
But it doesn't predict success.
Not strongly, no. Personality similarity correlations are generally weak, except maybe for neuroticism, two highly neurotic people might struggle.
Well, what does matter psychologically?
Authenticity within the relationship seems key. It correlates strongly with relationship satisfaction.
Being your real self.
Yes. And there might even be a link where low authenticity in one partner makes deception by the other more likely. The takeaway: to attract someone genuine, you probably need to be transparent yourself.
Does that mean oversharing everything?
Not necessarily. It's a balance, but generally, over-communication done diplomatically seems much better than under-communication.
Okay, what else?
This idea of grading potential partners on a curve.
Meaning?
Not against some perfect ideal, but relative to your other realistic options. What alternatives do you actually have?
Okay. And avoiding situations where one partner thinks they're way out of the other's league.
Exactly. That perception that I can do much better is dangerous for stability.
You also mentioned money-balling relationships.
Yeah, like in baseball analytics. Valuing traits that others might overlook, but which are really important for your happiness or relationship success.
Like what traits?
Conscientiousness in a partner is surprisingly predictive of your own career success and relationship duration.
Really? God.
Maybe they handle the household logistics well, they're reliable, supportive, it frees you up. Also, agreeableness and low neuroticism are huge for satisfaction.
Makes sense. What about intelligence? People want geniuses.
People often say they want someone smart, maybe around a 120 IQ, but the reality is the average difference between spouses is only about 10 IQ points.
And who usually has the higher IQ in a couple, man or woman?
The million-dollar question. Hypergamy might suggest men, traditionally. That informal phone-a-friend poll we talked about seemed to lean towards men having broader general knowledge, but that's hardly scientific.
Fair enough. What about red flags? Things to avoid?
Big ones. Trouble managing emotions, making you play guessing games about what they want or feel, character assault during arguments instead of focusing on the issue, the silent treatment.
How quickly someone recovers emotionally after a fight seems important too.
Very. Their emotional baseline recovery speed. Also, difficulty identifying or articulating emotions can be linked to things like borderline personality disorder traits, which are tough in relationships.
And green flags? What should we look for?
Stability, self-control, good communication, especially during conflict, not just when things are easy.
That quote about the lows, not the highs.
Visak and Verasamy. It's the lows, not the highs, that make or break a relationship. Absolutely spot on. Handling bad times well is crucial.
The 6-month mark is often mentioned too.
Shantae Smith's point. That's often when the initial best behavior wears off and true selves emerge.
And traveling together. The Joe Rogan test.
Great stress test. Throws curveballs, forces cooperation, reveals how people handle inconvenience. Generally, look for clarity and inquisitiveness. Avoid unclear, uncurious partners who make you guess.
This relates to that Princeton mom letter controversy, doesn't it?
It does. Despite the backlash, the core advice to young women to think seriously about finding a partner during college when the pool of similar available people is large is arguably quite reasonable.
Because mating prospects change after graduation.
Significantly for many. Louise Perry's analogy of the lamp and the house is great here.
How does that go?
It's easier to build the house of your life around the lamp of your partner if you find them earlier, rather than trying to fit a lamp into a fully built house later on.
The startup marriage versus the capstone marriage.
Exactly. And data shows a U-shaped curve for marriage age and divorce risk. Marrying too young is risky, but marrying too late also increases risk compared to marrying in your mid to late 20s.
So don't get lost in the side quests.
Right. Remember the potential importance of the main story, which for many people involves finding a life partner, seeing Gen Z delaying dating for various reasons. You wonder about potential midlife regrets if career is prioritized to the exclusion of relationships.
Jordan Peterson's point about conventional life.
Yeah, that for most people, a fairly conventional, life-stable job, marriage, family is actually the most reliable path to long-term happiness and satisfaction.
And the people advising against that path are often atypical themselves.
Often, yes. Successful, career-focused individuals who might not represent the average person's best shot at fulfillment.
Well, that was quite a journey, wasn't it? Through attraction, online behavior, relationships, all sparked by those sources.
Definitely unpacked some surprising connections and those deeper evolutionary forces at play.
Hopefully this deep dive has provided some valuable insights, maybe a few of those aha moments we mentioned.
And definitely some food for thought for navigating your own relationships or just understanding these dynamics better.
Yeah, and this is just scratching the surface, really. Each point could be a whole discussion.
Absolutely. We'd encourage listeners to reflect on what resonated, maybe dig a bit deeper into some of the research or ideas we touched on.
Thank you again for sharing your sources, your curiosity with us. We hope this tailored exploration was informative and engaging.
We do. Until our next deep dive, keep those insightful questions coming.